My name is Laura Villareal. Today is April 10th, 2024, and this recording is taking place in McKenna Hall at the University of Notre Dame. I'm here with U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limón, who I have the honor of interviewing today for the Letras Latinas Oral History Project. This is our first oral history project with you, so I think we should begin at the beginning. For the purpose of documentation, please tell us where you were born and grew up.
Yeah. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to be doing this and to be part of these archives. My name is Ada Limón, and I was born in Sonoma, California, and grew up in Sonoma, California, and Glen Ellen, California.
Where does your story begin as a writer? What made you want to become a poet?
You know, I love this question, and there's many ways to untangle it from my life, if you will. I think that for me, it began with a different kind of listening. Sometimes we talk about looking when it comes to poets, but for me, it was a different kind of listening. And I could hear a voice underneath the voice. That was me. And I didn't know what that was. And I wanted to pay more attention to it. And there was a place across the street from where I was born, or where I was raised. I moved in when I was 6 months old. And there was a creek called the Calabasas Creek. And it was you kind of had to scramble down a little path to get to it. Yeah. It wasn't like your big Texas beautiful rivers. It was very small, more of a small California creek. And there was this type of silence there that I felt really interested in and curious about. And it felt like a world that existed outside of time. And every time I think about where my poems start, it's there. That's where I feel like they begin.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but that's maybe where I first heard the voice underneath the voice of the whole world. And that was the beginning. I don't know how old I was, probably 5 or 6.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was really early on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but your mother's an artist?
My mother's a painter, yes.
Did that have any influence on you?
Absolutely. I think, one, it was just the value and care that my family had with the making of art. And having that as a model, knowing that it was important to make something, that it was valued to make something, that you could spend your whole day making a thing.
Yeah.
And I had the beautiful reality of growing up with someone who did that.
Yeah.
And I think I was very lucky.
Yeah.
A lot of permission granted.
That's incredible. I first came to your work in grad school. We were just talking about Rigoberto Gonzalez a moment ago. And I was in our class, it's called Writers at Newark, and we were reading your book, Sharks in the Rivers. It felt like an awakening to me. I came straight from undergrad to the MFA program, and I hadn't experienced work like yours. It was influential for me as a young Latina writer. It cleared the way for me to make space for my own writing in the world and how I wanted to see it. I wonder what poets have been foundational to your work, and in what ways have they influenced the writing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me. Sharks in the Rivers was a very important book to me, and also I love Rigoberto Gonzalez, so I was just happy to hold him here in our hearts. I think for me, when I was first in undergraduate, and that's when I first started studying poetry, I remember really early on finding the poems from Elizabeth Bishop, Anne Sexton, Lucille Clifton, and feeling like, oh, this is something I want to make. I'm interested in how to make this. And then on a personal note, I still remember one of the only books. I'm not someone who stands in line for to get a book signed. I don't know why. I just never have been. I think there's a level where I'm like, oh, I don't want to bother the person or whatever. But I did get my book signed by Francisco X. Arlocon for his book, the one with the snakes on it. The Snake Stories, I think it's called, Snakes. And I always think about his kindness and the way that he not only showed me so much generosity on a one-on-one level, but that book for me was a really important, pivotal book that I bought myself when I was 15 at the bookstore that I worked for. And I cherish it. I still have the copy at home with his signature.
Oh, that's incredible. I know that he's been influential for a lot of people.
Yeah.
You worked at a bookstore
I
when you were
did.
15?
I did.
Oh my gosh.
I worked at a bookstore, an independent bookstore that is still there, Reader's Books in Sonoma. And I walked across the street because it was across the street from the apartment I was raised in. And once my parents split, so it was not by the creek anymore, in town. And I said, I live right there, and I'll never be late. And so I worked there on and off from 15 to 21.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Have you read there?
I have.
Okay.
I do. Every book that comes out, I do a launch there.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's where I do my hometown launches. Yeah.
Besides California, you lived in New York for a while. Early in your career, you worked for Condé Nast, is that how you say it? Magazines like Martha Stewart Living, Travel and Leisure, and GQ. What was the experience like? Did working at magazines teach you anything that's helped you in your life as a poet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to me to think about the ways that artists make a living. I don't think it's something we talk about enough, and I think that there's a level of privilege sometimes that's assumed where we're not supposed to talk about it. Yeah. And I think it's actually really important to talk about the way that we support ourselves. Not everybody wants to teach, and not everybody can teach because there's not a lot of teaching positions out there in the world. And so I remember after graduate school really trying to figure out what my pathway forward was, that I could, stay in New York City to make my rent, not go too far into debt, although graduate school put me there anyway. Yeah. And I was lucky enough to get a temp job, and my first temp job was at GQ magazine. And then slowly but surely, I sort of worked my way around magazines and event production and all of those things until I landed in different places. But Condé Nast was a home for quite a few of them. From my first temp job, being there right out of graduate school, I was eventually the copy director at GQ magazine, and then from there, the last job I had, last full-time job I had there, was the creative services director for Travel and Leisure magazine. And I think one of the things that I liked about doing it, and I liked about the experience, was not only there were some great people that worked there, and good teams. It was lucky to be in that creative field. So you're working with designers and people who care about language and, photos and all of those things. That's exciting, that there is still this, idea of making, crafting something that matters, not just creating content, which I feel like we can lead more towards now. But I think that it allowed me in some ways to have some sort of basic security so that I could write whatever poems I wanted to write. And that was really important. It felt like I had a separate life, a separate career, and then I could really also support myself as an artist and allow myself whatever freedom I wanted to have. And those two worlds felt very separate to me, but they felt equally valuable. And it wasn't until 2010 when my stepmother passed away in February of 2010, and I gave my notice in August of 2010 and left in September. And I think it was, my stepmother died of colon cancer at 52. And I think even though I was in my early 30s, I thought, none of us know how long we have on this planet. Yeah. None of us know what kind of time we have left. So what do you want to devote yourself to? How do you want to spend your time? And even though I love New York City and I loved the team that I worked with, I knew more than anything that I wanted to be a full-time artist. I didn't know exactly what that looked like and what it would entail, but I moved out of New York City in 2010, back to Sonoma for 6 months, almost for a year, and really, did my best to devote myself to the creative life.
Yeah. So you went back home for 6 months. Did you go anywhere after that?
Yeah, and so then after that, my now husband, then partner, was moving to Kentucky.
Oh.
And he really wanted me to come with him there, and so that's how we ended up in Kentucky.
Oh.
Yeah, and so and Kentucky became a beautiful space for me to write, and of course I still had to freelance for all the magazines I worked for, which was great, which was actually really wonderful. But I still had more time to write, and Kentucky is where I wrote my book, Bright Dead Things, which came out in 2015, and on the day of its release, it was nominated for the long list of the National Book Award.
Oh, wow.
And so that was a very pivotal moment in my creative life that shifted really quite a bit of my of the way I thought about what was going to happen next, because I had no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, no one knows what's going to happen next. That's the most beautiful thing about life. We never know.
Yeah, I remember it coming out, and it was like a big event. Everybody was excited because you had books before that. So I want to talk about those a little bit.
Yeah.
As I was reading through your books, I couldn't get my hands on your chapbooks, but I read all the others. And I feel like there's a clear trajectory where your writing shifts into what we know as distinctly Ada Limón poems. I'd say they're marked by a strong voice and a clear radar for delight in the everyday. Your first two books, Lucky Wreck and This Big Fake World, are sort of outliers. As you were writing them, can you remember what some of your intentions were? I found it interesting that This Big Fake World is a story in verse. Did you or have you ever wanted to become a novelist?
Yeah, oh, that's lovely. I love This Big Fake World. It's a novel in verse, or a story in verse, and I still remember writing it and where I was, and I think that at the time, like many writers, I felt so sick of myself.
Yeah.
And I had a moment where I thought, if I put the I in a poem one more time, I just was like, I just don't want to do it. And you can see the shift in Lucky Wreck. You see moments where I do shift into the third person. She enters the world a ready, set, go girl. She comes with a list of things she cannot see. Like that's I'm just going to put something in the third person to free myself up. And then when I was writing writing This Big Fake World, it felt so nice to inhabit other people's worlds.
Yeah.
And it features the lady at the hardware store and the man in the gray suit. And the man in the gray suit sort of shifts his life and falls in love with the lady at the hardware store. And they're never named, but there's a love affair between them. And I just needed to imagine a different kind of world for a while, and it was nice to inhabit that in my mind. I have written 3 novels. I don't share them with anyone because to me they were sort of projects or experiments, efforts, and I love doing them. But they weren't, I could see where they could go further, or I could see, but I didn't have as much interest in bringing them to the next level. But I do think I got a lot out of it. I think it taught me a great deal about storytelling, about the imagination. And I think sometimes as writers, we give the imagination over to the prose writers, and we forget that poets get to have the imagination too, And so I think the novels really helped ignite and remind me about the incredible power of the mind and how far we can travel in our own imagination.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but you talked about the secret poems that
Yeah.
you write.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important that poets remember that you can just write things for yourself.
Yes.
You wrote 3 novels just for yourself,
Yeah.
just to understand imagination, and I think that's very clear in your work. I'm thinking of like Downhearted and
Yeah.
poems like that. With Lucky Wreck and This Big Fake World, they were published relatively close together. Were you writing them simultaneously, or was one manuscript done and you were shopping it around?
Mm-hmm.
How did that work?
Yeah. I know some of it was simultaneous, but I think Lucky Wreck was done before This Big Fake World. And then what happened was I was sending them out at the same time, and I was entering contests. Both of those books were contest winners, and that's how they got published. And I still remember getting the phone call from Autumn House about Lucky Wreck, and I was so sort of over the moon, and I thought, oh, this is amazing. It was chosen by Jean Valentine, who I'd never worked with at NYU, but who was at NYU while I was there, and then it was only 6 months later, so Lucky Wreck hadn't even come out, that I got a phone call about This Big Fake World. And I remember having the fear, because many of these contests that we enter as new writers, whatever age we are, but as we send out new books, many of them are first book contests.
Yeah.
So I was a little scared that when the woman called me from Pearl Editions to accept This Big Fake World, I said, I just want you to know that if this was a first book, I actually already have a first book that's coming out. And she said, no, this can be a second book. It's just a prize. So that's how that ended up happening so that it ended up that Lucky Wreck came out in March of 2026, and This Big Fake World came out in January of 2026, and then This Big Fake World came out like 5 months afterwards.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
It must have felt, how did it feel to have 2 books in the world that close together? I know having just like one out the world feels like
I think that there's, the one thing that I'll say about that was that I had, for Lucky Wreck, I put together a tiny tour for myself, and included readings at my parents' house, and things like that, and all the little things that you do. I went to AWP in Austin and did a reading at UT Austin, and there were just people invited me some places, and I put it together. But of course, I paid for it myself, and with miles, and tried to figure out how to put together this little trip. And to be honest, when This Big Fake World came out, I didn't have any more time off that I could take from the magazine world. And I also just didn't have the funds to spend to put myself on a little tour. So the only thing I regret is that it was so beautiful to have them both out, but I still think that I didn't give as much light as I wish I could have to This Big Fake World. And that was just because, I was a woman working in Brooklyn and, making a living, but with no excess income whatsoever. And so that was a little hard, was that I still feel like, oh, that book deserves a little more light.
Yeah. I mean, that's a reality for all writers.
No, like I said,
new poets.
I think it's really important to talk about. We just don't talk about it enough. I feel like there's a strange embarrassment around money, and I think it's really important that artists talk about it. I think it's really important that artists of color talk about it. And, it helps people recognize that they're not alone. If a book, they can't get out and support it, for whatever reason, that's okay, and that they're not alone.
Yeah, I love that. As I mentioned earlier, your work is distinct. Your poems are voice-driven, unfolding deliberately, paced narratives, and building on extended metaphor. Often they have a quick turn of revelation at the end. I think for most writers, there's a moment where they recognize what makes their work truly theirs. Was there a certain poem where you realized you had sort of hit your stride, or perhaps a moment where you felt like you understood what made your poems truly yours?
Thank you for all the praise and that beautiful question, by the way. I think I don't know if there was a specific moment as much as there was a recognition that poems could be talking to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that on the other end, there didn't always have to be another poet. There could also be a person that had never read a poem, you know, or maybe read prose.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they were just people that loved novels, or they read the short stories, or whatever it was. And I thought, what about if I wrote poems for not just poets? And that was a shift. And I think that when I look at my work now, even though I'm still writing, like all my first readers are writers, all my first readers are poets. My main editor is my stepfather.
Oh.
And he was a short story writer for years. He doesn't write prose much at all anymore, but he just has a really keen eye, and he has a big heart, and I have always really admired the way that he looked at my poems. And, you know, he didn't graduate from college. He's, you know, not someone that, he's extremely educated, but all in a way that he did on his own.
Yeah.
And I think being raised in a community where everyone found art at their own pace allowed me to open myself up to the opportunities of writing for not just a contained community, not just for people with MFAs in poetry, not just people with college degrees, right?
Yeah.
But for everyone and for anyone. And I think that shift is really evident in the book Bright Dead Things.
Yeah. Who are some of your first readers who, I know, like, we don't write alone. Who are the people that help support you and are in community with you?
Yeah, community is so important. And it can feel sometimes like we are writing alone, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're not.
We're not.
And we're in conversation. Every poem's in conversation with whatever we just read. Every, poem's in conversation with the beautiful conversation we had at lunch today. Mm-hmm. All of these things with our life, with our bodies, with what ails us, with what fuels us. Poems will be different depending on whether or not we're hydrated or rested,
Yeah, that's true.
But for me, my first readers are my stepfather, Brady, and then my mother. But then a group of poets, primarily from my graduate school days at NYU. Yeah. Jennifer L. Knox, Jason Schneiderman, Natalie Diaz, not from graduate school, but from later on in the poetry world. Adam Clay, and there's so many, but being able to have friends that you can send poems to, and that will immediately get back and encourage you, even if they give you like a little, this, I would fix this or this, that's fine. But as long as they're like, keep going, keep going, keep going. And you'd be surprised, I'm on book 6, mm-hmm. 7th will be coming, and it's, we still need all the encouragement we can get. There's no part of me that ever, doesn't need to hear keep going.
Yeah, no, that's very real.
Yeah.
How did you identify them as like readers for your work? I know sometimes young writers are trying to find the right folks to read their work and engage with it and help edit it. Is there like a thing you're like, this person's really good?
Yeah, I think with Jennifer Knox and Jason Schneiderman, both from graduate school, with them there's a particular way that we write really, really differently.
Yeah.
And so they were never trying to make me do what they do. Mm-hmm. And, and I feel like that was a part of all of our relationships. Like Jason is incredibly intellectual, philosophical work. Jen's work is really muscular and super, it's funny, but it's got a dangerous edge to it. And I think mine is much more heart-centered. And there's not a part of us that we don't ever say, oh, you should be doing this because that's what I do.
Yeah.
Instead, they know me well enough and trust me that, oh, this is what I think you want to be doing, or this is what I think this intention is.
Yeah.
And so I think that was part of why we've all stuck together as a group of readers for each other, is that we trust the other person to not be rewriting our poems in their own voice, because our voices are so distinctly different.
Yeah.
But kindness above all. People also getting back to you, you know?
Yeah.
There's a times where you send poems out and they don't respond, and you think, oh, okay, probably not the person I'll be exchanging poems with.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. And yeah, kindness and encouragement.
I love that.
Yeah,
Earlier,
above all.
earlier I talked to Carmen, and she mentioned, like, I was asking how she gets her authors to create the innovative and just like wildly spectacular pieces that they do, and it's that encouragement, like, oh, I recognize that you're doing this, and then helping them amplify it, which it sounds like they're doing for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like there's also a level now, because we've worked together for so long, since we were little babies in graduate school, that they can also say, oh, you've done this before.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
They can say, oh, maybe it's a beautiful sister poem to this poem, or they can say, this is essentially this other poem that you wrote.
Yeah.
And that's really important too, is to build those relationships so you have that kind of longevity with those people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you guys in workshops together?
We were, yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember who were some of your workshop leaders?
Oh, my very first workshop was Phil Levine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was incredible. Beautiful.
Another person who's had an influence on so many writers.
So many writers, yeah. And that workshop was everything to me. I mean, he was very tough, but he also really taught me what to fight for, what to hold on to. He was always alone in his office hours. I feel like everyone was scared of him. And so I would go to his office hours like every day and just hang out with him and, just chat with him, because he was just, and he'd read anything you offer, will you read this? Oh yeah, sure, I'd read this. And that was a really amazing experience. And then right after that, it was Sharon Olds.
Oh, wow.
So I went from this sort of very tough, a person with a very sort of hard-won sense of the poem, and then Sharon, who and another great mind, both of them incredibly intelligent. But she is very interested in creating a sort of safe and tender environment for the writer, whereas Phil is like, all right, this was doing a much more tough love, if you will, kind of workshop.
That's a nice balance, though.
Yeah, I think it was really important for me to have them both the very first year. Yeah.
I feel like it probably helped you hone your sensibilities about how to edit and self-edit. Yeah,
and there were times where I could hear Phil's voice in my head, right? And there were times where I could hear Sharon's voice in my head. And it was like, oh, these are both really important people to have as I move forward as a writer.
Do you still feel like, as you're writing, do you hear them at all? Or how do you just kind of
You know what, I don't think I hear them as much, but sometimes when I edit my poems, I can imagine, I think they're still there. I think they're more faint whispers now, but they're definitely still there. I mean, now the biggest thing that I have to, think about who I was in my 20s in that graduate program, and so much of what you do as a young poet is mimic.
Yes.
And so now I think that I almost can't hear them, but it's not because they're not there, but it's because I don't want to borrow from their beautiful oeuvre of work, it feels like they are who they are, and I don't want to, have too much influence, because I think as a 20-year-old I was like, oh, I will figure out how to make these poems by really trying to mimic what they did. And now very interested in continuing to listen to the voice underneath the voice that's my own.
Yeah, I love that. Do you feel like you continue to surprise yourself by what that voice tells you as you're writing?
Yeah. Yeah. It changes all the time. It shifts all the time. You know, sometimes it's doing more grief work than I expect. And sometimes it's highly irreverent.
Yeah.
It's a little more rebellious than I expect. But I think, yeah, it is always surprising me. And it's interesting because I started meditating in earnest in 2007. And, you know, so much of what they teach you when you're learning to meditate or when you're starting to meditate is this sort of, you know, presence in the body and this idea of being able to just notice your own thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, like it's not really emptying the mind because that's very difficult to do. But there's moments of stillness that exist. And I have found that my meditation practice, now going on, you know, almost 20 years, has really helped me continue to hear that voice. Because I've been able to continually figure out moments of stillness.
Oh, yeah.
And find stillness in even the abundant chaos that is life.
Yeah.
Right? And so I didn't know that my meditation practice would be so important to my poetry work. But I'm really, really glad that I have them both.
Yeah, I think that's important. And it definitely shows in your work. You mentioned the quiet, and I thought immediately of the Quiet Machine.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you're on book 7. I have a question about that.
Yeah.
You know, you've been steadily publishing a book every 3 to 4 years since the first 2. What are you working on currently? And when's the next one coming out?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of great projects that are happening that I'm excited about. But the next poetry book will come out in I think it'll be 2025, but and that's going to be a new and selected.
Oh.
Yeah, which I'm really excited about. I'm also scared about. There's something to be in your late 40s that you're like, wait, this is too soon for a new and selected. But book 7 is about the time that, you know, they ask that of you. And so so I'm putting that together. And so there's a lot of new work in that new and selected, as well as a lot of the work coming together in one place, which is exciting. And then in this October, my poem that is engraved on the spacecraft is being illustrated by the incredible Czech illustrator Peter Sis, and it's being turned into a children's book.
Oh.
And so that'll come out in October of this year. And so those are the things that I'm working on now. And then there's a children's book that's coming out in January 2025, which is the poem And to the Fox from The Herding Kind. So 2 children's books in the work, and then the new and selected. And then after that, I think that I have already started a new book of poems.
Book 8. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of things to be working on.
A lot of things, and I'm, you know,
different from what you've done so far.
Yeah, yeah. No, and of course, just this week or last week, we launched the anthology "You Are Here," which is 50 different contemporary poems from, you know, folks that are speaking back to the natural world, and that's been a really amazing project too. So, and that's my first anthology that I've ever done. So it feels like there's a lot of new things in the works, which I'm excited about. But poetry is my home.
Yeah.
And writing my own poetry is still my focus and my joy.
Yeah.
So it'll continue. You know, I think my goal is to be a really beautiful 100-year-old
like Merwin.
sitting on the porch feeding my birds and writing poems.
Oh, I love that.
Just like Merwin, yes.
How have you been thinking about the new and selected? What kinds of things are on your mind as you're choosing poems from the past?
Yeah.
Are you thinking about?
It's very interesting. It's very interesting to me because, I have favorites, but then I also know what other people's favorites are. Like now I've been doing this long enough, 20 some years, where now I have students who say, oh, this was they're graduating from their graduate programs, but they say, oh, I read this poem of yours in high school, or whatever it was. And so now I have this sort of like, oh, wow, of course, yes, it's been 14 years since that book or since this or since that. And so so I think that the way that I'm hoping to think about it is sort of a celebration of the first half.
Oh, I love that.
It's the sort of celebration of the first half with the implication that we are just getting started.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the best way to approach it. And so the new poems that you're writing, are they in conversation with some of the old ones, or are they their own kind of thing and part of the 8th book?
That's a great question. I feel like there are poems that are in conversation.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they're, it's one life.
Yeah.
So how can they not be in conversation sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, the poem that is going on the spacecraft to the Europa Clipper that will launch in October. That poem will be in there, right? Because it's an occasional poem that came out of that. There's a poem called Startlement, which I wrote for the National Climate Assessment, for the front matter of the National Climate Assessment, and that poem will be in there. So there'll be some sort of more, if you think of it, more public-facing poems.
Yeah.
But I want that to be balanced with some really private poems.
Mm-hmm.
So the big thing for me, because I actually do have quite a bit of work,
Mm-hmm.
is not putting too many new poems in there, because I want it to be, many, but then
Mm-hmm.
I also want to make sure that I start to think about the next book and what that will look like and what poems need to go in that one.
Yeah. I think we should probably talk about, kind of the elephant in the room. You're the first Latina to be the Poet Laureate. How has your tenure as the Poet Laureate felt, and what's been your favorite project so far in the role?
Yeah, well, thank you. Being the first of anything is always a double-edged sword.
It is, yeah.
Because it's, of course, an honor, and there's a beautiful gift to it, and you want to fill it with all of the joy and light and power that you can.
Yeah.
But then there's another level in which you think, well, how is this possible, right? How has this not happened before? And then there's another level where there's a pressure, because you feel like you want to, anything that I do, I also want to do in an excellent way, and yet it's very easy to think, oh, now I'm not only representing myself, but, every Latina in the world. So I have to kind of slough that off sometimes, because it's very easy for me to be hard on myself and to be like, oh, let me think of the ways I'm failing,
Oh, no.
and so I think I really have been reframing a lot of that in my mind, and to think about just what a joyous opportunity this has been. I think I was really overwhelmed in the beginning. Just to give context, is that, so today is April 10th, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've already now served 2 terms, my first term beginning in September of 2022. And I think in September of 2022, I could just barely catch my breath.
Yeah.
It was overwhelming, it was beautiful, but I immediately did events at the White House. I immediately, it was just like bam, 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 bam. And I think now there's a little more, okay, now I know what we're doing. I know what the role requires. And I know what I want to do within it.
Yeah.
And so it's been a really remarkable experience to you kind of start out of breath, and now I'm getting to a place of like, oh, right, I know how to breathe. Just had to remind myself a little bit. And the big thing that, there's so many exciting things we've done so far. And the collaboration with NASA for the poem on the spacecraft has been huge and wonderful, and working with the NASA team has been amazing. And then now, this week, we just launched the You Are Here Poetry in the Natural World project. And there's one element of it, which is a anthology of 50 original nature poems by contemporary poets writing today. And this book is just incredible. It's published by Milkweed Editions in partnership with the Library of Congress. And it's hardcover and gorgeous and urgent and strange and full of joy and praise and also grief and rage. And it's just really one of the honors of my lifetime to put it together, because the poems are just so exquisite. And then the second part of that is that I'm working with the Poetry Society of America along with the National Park Service to put 7 different poems in 7 different national parks around the United States. And that project will continue, but I will go and visit them, all of them, and unveil these poetry installations, which are basically sort of oversized picnic tables that people can sit around. Yeah. And the parks that are included are Cape Cod, National Seashore, the Everglades, Smoky Mountains, Cuyahoga Valley, then Redwoods, Mount Rainier, Saguaro, and is that it? I think that's it. And it's just been incredible to work with these partners and making this happen, because it feels like I'm all for the unexpected and surprising interaction with poetry. I don't know if that's happened for you, but if I'm on the bus, or I've been many times in New York City where I'm like, oh, and I read a poem by Tracy K. Smith, and I still remember exactly where I was standing when I first read that poem. And, there's so many different kind of experiences that we have with poetry, but it's often the ones that are surprising or unexpected that stick with you for a long time or shift you. And so I'm very excited to see what happens with these poems in these parks and how people interact with them. And then there's a chance, every poem on the side of it has written, what would you say to the landscape around you?
Oh.
And so people can respond and write their own poem, and there's a hashtag, You Are Here Poetry, and they can just share it and then make their own poems. And, it doesn't even have to be a poem. It could just be a line. It could be a sentence. But I'm encouraging people to not only read, but to also write in response to the natural world.
Yeah. Who are some of the poets represented by those national parks and those picnic tables?
Thank you. This comes full circle a little bit, because I was really happy with the Redwoods National Parks is that I get to include a poem called Alone by Francisco X. Arlacon, and it's just been so beautiful to have his work there, since he was such a light in my life and in my journey. And when he passed, I remember feeling very sorrowful that I hadn't had a chance to thank him. And in some ways, I feel like this is my way of thanking him. So his poem will be in the Redwoods. Mount Rainier has A.R. Ammons, which is a great poem.
Yeah.
And then Mary Oliver has a poem. We'll have a poem in Cape Cod. Then we have Lucille Clifton in the Smoky Mountains. We have June Jordan in the Everglades. And then in sort of a tribute to, we have Jean Valentine in Cuyahoga Valley. And then as a tribute to Joy Harjo's incredible project for her laureateship, which was Living Nations, Living Words. When we were discussing which poem would go into Saguaro, we were thinking that it could be a living poet, which is the only living poet that we're using, and her name is Ofelia Zapata, and the poem's just incredible. And the event for Saguaro will actually be just featuring her, and I'll be sort of in the background. but it's an opportunity to also talk about indigeneity and the impact the national parks have had on sacred lands. And so I think it's just, the project really has come together in a way that continues to surprise and delight me as we go forward. I think it's going to be really powerful.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I hope I get to go to these parks.
Please do.
I guess just a general question to conclude, but what do you hope for the future of the laureateship?
Yeah, it's very interesting because you can't help but when you're in this role to just really start thinking about the next person that will hold this role, which is interesting because it goes by very fast. Like one term, you could just do one term, but that's just a year. And really the year is September through April. It's like an academic year or congressional year. And so I for one would really love to see someone keep up the momentum of bringing poetry into places that we may not expect it. And I would also love the laureateship to be a way of talking to not just poets, but to readers of all ages and of all different types of educational backgrounds. I would also love for the laureateship to bring people to the library and to celebrate libraries. I know that for me, my local library in Sonoma, California is still very significant in my life. It's so beautiful, and it's where I remember first reading poems and first reading, that thrill of going to the library and coming back with a stack of books, thinking, how am I even allowed to do this? And then I think also, for me, in my last term, what I really hope to do is to be as inclusive as possible and to really highlight the different ways that poetry can be available to us. Yeah. That not all of us are going to like the same poem. Mm-hmm. Not all of us are going to have the same reaction to the same, poetry. And that's okay. And so I feel like if I can allow all readers to have some kind of new curiosity when it comes to poetry, that would really be very heartening for me. And I hope that as I sort of, tour the national parks and then have my last event almost a year from today, wow. That I can look back and really say to myself, yeah, I left it all on the mat. That I really amplified a lot of different voices and for the most part amplified the power that poetry can have.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think we're all very lucky to have you as our Poet Laureate.
Thank you so much. Those were really beautiful questions.